Peculiar things caught. One late summer evening, while up on the Big Horn, I'd been working a large pot of rainbows just down from the 3-car hole, when I had an interesting experience. The sun was setting and I was about to lay my fly down, when my backcast was interrupted by a thud. It was a bat, a flying rodent, which had mistaken my fly for an edible insect and was flapping and squeaking on the bank. Another time I landed a barn swallow, which hadn't really surprised me at the time because the air had been filled with swooping marvels. Once while surf casting I caught a seagull. That gull had been lucky it didn't get hooked, but the darn thing just didn't want to let go of my bait. However, of all the game birds to fish for, seagulls are only second to pelicans for sport. It's kind of like flying a living kite using a rod and reel. I remember once hiking into a secret spot on the North Platte. While setting up camp, I began hearing loud splashes across the river not far from my tent. I set up my rod in the near dark and started working the far bank with a large streamer. The splashing continued and I was sure there was a 10-pound brown trout right there by my camp, letting me know he wanted to be caught. Finally, I hooked onto something, but it didn't feel like a fish. My line was slowly pulled off the reel toward the opposite bank. At first, I couldn't tell what was crawling out of the river 20 feet away in the dim light. But when I got a little closer, I found myself face to face with a 60-pound beaver. Of all the darn creatures to catch, a beaver is unquestionably one of the most undesirable. I was sure it would attack my tent and gnaw my leg off while I slept. I now recognize the slapping tail warning a beaver gives when there is an intruder too close to its lodge, and will never mistake that sound for a trout again. Once on a dock in San Francisco, I spent some free time fishing shoulder to shoulder with a crowd of local anglers. I remember having to cast straight out in order to avoid tangling my line. After a few throws, I had the good fortune to catch a mackerel. The old salt next to me told me I'd better reel that fish in quick or else. By the time I had a chance to ask or what, a 500-pound sea lion came out of nowhere and took that mackerel, along with my hook and line. Well, I figured a 500-pound sea lion would put up a better fight than a skinny, 1-pound mackerel, and started to reel the orca-sized mammal in. Unsurprisingly, that didn't work out for the best. The sea lion was so strong, I nearly got myself yanked right over the rail and into the ocean. Finally, I had to cut the line. Well, that sea lion really made a fool of me, and took half my line and my last hunk of bait too. Another time, down in Florida, some fine old southern gentleman took me on an interesting nocturnal fishing expedition along the Caloosahatchee River. Believing fly fishing was a sport based on the premise, the better the fight, the better the fishing, they enjoyed fly fishing for big gators. Well, as you can imagine, throwing a large chicken patterned in the Everglades can be tricky. A thick, stout rod is needed, and once you've been able to place your fly near a pair of menacing fluorescent eyes, the action is always fast and furious. Although, you do have to be careful when extracting the hook. Also, a boat is required, because wading can be hazardous. One of the best fights I ever had was, of course, with something other than a fish. I was in the Bristol Bay area of Alaska on a remote part of the Mulchatna River, where I was fishing for silver salmon. I had hooked into a big one, when out of the trees came a 2,000-pound grizzly bear. To my surprise, that world record-sized bear jumped right into the river and pounced on my salmon. Well, it was quite a predicament. Normally, I would have just cut the line and let that big mean grizzly have my salmon. But that salmon was hooked with the only fly in my box that was working that day. Naturally, that bear ate my salmon and got my lucky fly stuck right in his upper lip, and the fight began. Understandably, that grizzly was none too pleased with the circumstances, but I was determined to get that fly back. At first, the bear ran back into the woods, but I'd cranked up the drag on my reel and had plenty of backing, so was able to slow the monster's escape. Keeping my rod tip up, it took some doing, but I finally fought that abnormally large grizzly back to the river. Eventually, I started to subdue the beast, but when the behemoth got close enough to see the nature of his distress, that bear got ornery and charged me like a raging bull. Well, I should have climbed a tree then, but I'd been fighting that grizzly for a while and really wanted that fly back, so we ended up wrestling for some time. After a long scuffle, I finally got the better of the brute, and that fly proved to be well worth the struggle. Mind you, it did end up being an expensive conquest, me having to buy a new vest and waders after the incident. But that grizzly bear was nothing compared to what I caught up on the Ruby River once. I remember incident as vividly as if it were yesterday, perhaps because I'm constantly reminded of the strange episode every time I go out back to the shed. It had been mid-July. I was fishing the upper stretch of the Ruby, right under the dam. The sun had set an hour before, and I was waiting for the near full moon to rise. The fish were still knocking the hell out of a number 14 atoms in the complete darkness, when my backcast was once again interrupted by a snag. Frustrated, I looked to the heavens and pondered the 100 million stars, knowing not to tug too hard because it would be impossible to tie on a new fly in that darkness. When I finally turned around to find the snag, I saw the strangest thing I'd ever laid eyes on. It was a little green, glow-in-the-dark, dang-darn alien, with my flipping fly stuck right in the index finger of its three-fingered hand. Feeling bad that I hooked the little bugger and still shocked at the odd sight, I hurried over to the poor extraterrestrial, making apologies all the way. When I got close to the big-eyed, cucumber-headed midget, I politely reached out to shake his hand in greeting. Well, that was a mistake, because as soon as I touched the little fella, it was like drinking too much coffee and grabbing an electric fence. When I finally regained consciousness, I found myself in the brightly lit confines of what appeared to be the interior of a flying saucer. Panicking, I remembered hearing what those nefarious aliens had done to those unfortunate cattle up on Garden Creek, and didn't want to suffer the same fate. Getting off the operating table, I shoved over a robot and quickly found a porthole in what looked like a hatch. When I looked out the window, I saw the spaceship was hovering only 50 feet above the treetops. My plan formed immediately. I took out my spare reel from my fishing vest and tied the end of the line to a bulkhead over the door. By hitting every button on a panel with the strange symbols, I got the hatch to swing open. I tightened the drag down on my reel and stepped out, dangling by my fly line. Cranking the reel, I slowly lowered myself to the top of a tall, spindly pine. Once I reached the tree, I started climbing down, threading my line through the branches just like I was weaving a basket. When I finally got to the ground, I realized I had one hell of a sturdy fly rod and was hooked onto the darnest trophy ever caught anywhere near Twin Bridges. So without any hesitation, I started to reel that flying saucer in. Well, it was one heck of a fight. That flying saucer revved up and took me down to the last of my backing on a couple of runs. The pine tree bent but did not break, and miraculously my knot and the line both held. And after an hour-long battle, I finally landed that alien spaceship, crew and all. The boys down at the taxidermy shop gave me some strange looks when I was having that little green fellow stuffed. And since then, I've gotten a lot of inquiring comments about my shiny, high-tech-looking new tool shed out back. But, not wanting people to think I'm crazy, I never try to explain.